Zdrajcie, dragi zrители! Do you really think we'd let Orktober pass without giving the boys their due? Nie ma dostanie. How does Underbelly do it? But yes, while the Tin Boys are quite intriguing, for this rat, the best Xenos in the setting have to be the Orks. And we will cap off Orktober by talking about one of the most important and, from what I have found, biggest ork in the 40k setting, Tuska Daemon-Killa. A sizable claim that I'm confident you'll agree with by the end of this video. Surprisingly enough, his path to infamy began when he was already a war boss leading his own WA. At some point in 890 M41, while sailing in through the Immaterium, the Geller field, a force field of reality being generated around a ship in order to keep it protected from the influence of the warp, of his kill cruiser, the Gorejaw, failed spectacularly, choice of words intended, resulting in its insides being invaded by demons, including one particularly nasty and girthy beastie that was turning whatever greenskins it came across to paste as it rampaged in the ship's bowels. Hearing all of the commotion, Tuska would equip his trusty Power Claw and rush to find the source of the fighting, culminating in him cornering the massive monstrosity in the vessel's bridge, which the demon had just finished repainting with the splattered crew. Both then leapt upon each other with wanton abandon, their savagery lasting for a significant while. In the end, however, regardless of how terrifying it was, the never-born creature would be taught a very important lesson that most of the galaxy ought to know by now. Green is best! After overpowering and putting the creature down, Tuska would rip its horns off and keep them as his first trophy. Now, those more knowledgeable among you might raise an eyebrow at this. Demons' bodies completely dissolve upon being damaged to the point of being banished, especially when you go back out in real space. So how could he have kept the horns? What I can offer as an explanation is that, simply put, Tuska's hype after the battle, maybe even mixed in with that of his surviving boys, was enough to generate enough WA energy that would, for lack of a better term, nourish the bodily components to the point where they can remain in existence, separated from their original entity, as long as they were in their new owner's possession. Which I think is suitable enough, given the general rule of the setting that via the warp, believing in something to bring it about, further supplemented by the fact that via the WA energy they generate, orks are capable of bringing about such things into reality more easily than other races. And what hype it must have been, because after that day, Tuska got a massive taste for fighting the nasties of the Immaterium and would go on to earn his moniker Daemon-Killa. At first, he just ordered his ships to dive more often and for longer in the warp, whilst bringing on as many weird boys, ork psychers to oversimplify, to act as bait for the sharks, so to speak. Not long after, given the orkish craving for things to be faster, he stopped having the Geller fields be turned on at all, and the haul of phenomenally ferocious scraps with the spiky things was good for a time. But sadly for dear Tuska and his boys, they never came across anything as big and scary as in that first chance encounter that set them on this path. Worse yet, gradually, their vessels would begin to see less and less and less demonic incursions until practically all of their fishing attempts came up dry, regardless of how much bait and ease of access they could provide. To any normal, pansy git of a species out in the galaxy, that would have seemed like supreme fortune. But to this band of orks, it was more so a cause for unyielding rage, rather than a call to buy a lottery ticket. Despite how baffling of a thing it was, there was an easy explanation as to why the Daemon-Killa's trophy stopped seeing new additions. To briefly go over something that might be explored in more detail in the future, demons, along with basically all of the creatures that naturally call the warp their home, are predators. Some significantly smarter than others, but even the most cognitively base among them that lack sentience follow an instinct. Just like animals in our real world, a predator will hunt prey, but if something starts actively murder mulching it back, even an animal will eventually learn to steer clear of it. While he was likely not the first orc to pioneer it, Tuska and his Wa had really dedicated themselves to be the embodiment of this meme. Yes, they were crumpin' something fierce, so much so that demons began to actively avoid their vessels, despite being extremely undefended and filled to the brim with psychers to feast on, because it was simply not worth it. How very selfish of them, isn't it? Understandably, Tuska was left supremely furious when he noticed it. But he had been a war boss for years now, and in addition to being great at crumpin', he had also become quite cunning, demonstrated by a plan of such morkish goodness that it has been rarely equaled by other orcs in the intellectual field. If the demons wouldn't come to him, he would go to them. Thus, his entire fleet-based Wa flew off to Cadia. It was only a brief pit stop for them, and they likely gave a lot of the Cadian High Command heart attacks via the prospect of getting an orc infestation of their surrounding planets, which was the last thing they needed, given their position as the literal bulwark against chaos. Thankfully, for the poor men and women of the Guard and Navy, Tuska had no interest in them. What he was after was barging into the Eye of Terror itself. Normally, the Imperium prevents things from coming out of that infernal wound in reality, so something trying to get in there was a surprise in of itself. Thinking that the bumbling Xenos could probably delay the next big chaos push out of the Eye at least a bit, orders were dispensed to let their fleet pass more or less unimpeded whatsoever by Imperial forces. While we don't know if he delayed anything, Tuska most certainly made a great showing of himself, gathering a lot of attention from the denizens of the Immaterium. Specifically, in the same fashion of a hooligan biker gang rolling into a neighborhood and trashing the locals' yards. His Wa were able to conduct successful invasions upon the chaos-drenched demon worlds writhing in the Eye, mainly thanks to mindset, in addition to their physical abilities. Because if a human, as an example, were to land on one, they would likely lose their sanity from, say, "The sky is bleeding! The water shows me the ghastly faces of my dead comrades telling me life and struggle are pointless, and I can't get a wink of sleep because the grass screams from the slightest touch." It would be nightmarish. But put an orc in such a situation and it would go like this instead.
"The sky bleeding? Awesome! Free drinks, everyone! Water showing me ghosts to the other boys, telling me everything's bad. Shut up, you git! You's dead! That means you's a weak pansy, so your opinion's invalid. And the grass be screaming when you touch it. That shit's hilarious!"
And thus, they continued to merrily terrorize and brutalize a number of demon worlds, gathering the direct attention of specifically Khorne. Both due to their violent entry, and because before landing on the first planet owned by the Blood God, Tuska's Wa ravaged worlds belonging to the other Chaos Gods, which greatly amused the King of the Skull Throne. Said Khorne planet was under the care of a demon prince named the Blood Prince. Ah, good old Khorne, so profoundly simple. Good thing he doesn't use wolf in his naming conventions. At long last, despite having a good roll with everything, having been depleted from their unceasing scrapping on the previous planets, Tuska and his boys finally met their match in the face of the unceasing legions of the Blood Prince, who was butchering them to the last. However, before he could finish Daemon-Killa himself, a bunch of the surviving weird boys briefly distracted the Great Demon, allowing their boss to make one final kill, namely murdering the Blood Prince's dignity by stabbing his groin with his power claw. Almost as good as Grimgor kicking Archeon in the nuts. Howling in an embarrassing fashion, the Blood Prince would finally lop off the wounded Tuska's head as he was tearing his lungs with laughter, putting an end to one glorious series of scraps. Or so he thought. To the poor demon's horror, Khorne had watched practically every moment of the Orks' breach into the Eye of Terror and their rampage up to this end. And frankly, like most of the Warhammer fanbase, he found it utterly hilarious. So much so that he just brought all of the dead orcs back to life. Not really questioning it, Tuska and his lads just cheered in delight and resumed fighting until they were put down again. and on the next morning they rose again. The Blood God delighted in their vandal nature and hooliganism, so much so that he blessed them with infinite respawns. On top of which, he had not removed their ability to shed spores while breathing or when dying, meaning that over time, the number of orks began to grow, literally as their species grow like fungus, not only replenishing the Waa's original numbers, but surpassing it with no end in sight. Personally, I would wonder if Khorne wasn't partially rubbed on by Slaanesh, delighting not only in the Greenskin's antics, but also from his minions' pained suffering of having to deal with them. Whatever the case, the Blood God's love of the goofy murder hobos reached a point where he chose to collect them as an army. As in, he spirited away every single ork that was on that planet and summoned them at the base of his brass citadel at the heart of his personal domain. Still blessed with infinite respawns, still growing their numbers every day, locked in an eternal fight against the Skull Throne's infinite legions. Thus, Tuska and his lads became the happiest orks in existence, as they had finally reached true ork paradise, a never-ending scrap. This is where I would argue that Tuska Daemon-Killa is not only the happiest, but also the biggest ork in the existing setting, based on the fact that orks grow off of adrenaline and fighting stronger opponents. To summarize, he was already a war boss leading a Waa in a little over 40 years before the earliest known reference of Ghazgul in 932 M41, when he was still a regular boy and got his brains blown out, setting him on the path of becoming the prophet of Gork and Mork and his Waas against Armageddon. In those 40 years, Tuska was actively hunting fights with demons until eventually he got in the Eye of Terror and finally ended up in Khorne's front yard. No set date has been given as to when he pulled this stunt going into the Eye, but given that Kaeya was still around, and worried more about the orks becoming permanent residents than stuff coming out of the literal hellhole above their heads, it must have been a decent while before the 13th Black Crusade in 999 M41 that finally destroyed Kaeya, which gives him an even bigger head start in the growing field. Now, some will probably point to Gaz's Waa that occupied a space hulk being tossed around the warp for an unknown amount of time before hitting Armageddon and later in future travels, since time in the warp can flow very weirdly compared to real time. But the same can easily go in Tuska's favor, given how his boys were actively messing with the warp while they traveled through it with the intention of hosting demon beatdowns, then voluntarily diving into the most potent warp anomaly in the known galaxy, and ending up as the first and only bit of greenery in the Blood God's garden. Honestly, at this point I wouldn't be surprised if it was revealed that all of the orks in the Daemon-Killa's Waa were proper Krork-sized, but maybe still more on the regressed orcish side mentally, due to spending Emperor knows how long juicing on Khorne demons like psychic protein Capri Suns. Yeah, Gaz fights the Imperial Guard and Space Marines a lot, but while I don't want to diss the badass soldiers of humanity, Astartes excluded, that is nowhere as potent of a training regime as duking it out with elite demons literally 24/7, with Tuska's only time for rest being the enforced timeout caused if one of them manages to kill him. But that is not the only matter I wish to bring up in this video. As while creating it, I had a bit of a realization for a theory. When I mentioned it to some people, they asked, "Are you stupid?" To which I said, yes, but hear me out. In this rat's opinion, this could be a setup for Khorne to suffer a fall caused by his hubris like a hero from Greek myth if he doesn't permanently deal with Tuska and his boys in the near future. The bigger orks get, and the more of them there is, the more Waa energy they generate. Waa energy being their species' mostly subconscious expression of controlling the warp, which enables them to do a lot of the wacky things we love them for. Like for example their crude machinery actually working, or red-painted things being faster if the orks believe in those things. Waa energy is in essence the manifested power of their twin gods, Gork and Mork. At this point, I'd like to tie in another theory which poses that when creating the Eldar and the Khorks to fight the Necrons, the Old Ones taught the Knife-Ears how to make their own and crafted the twin deities of the mushrooms as manifestations of the species themselves in the Materium for the express purpose of being akin to psychic dampeners, lessening their benefit to chaos. Or to clarify in more simple terms with the example we have been talking about earlier in the video, both the Eldar and Orks will unleash bucket loads of violence on a galactic scale in the upcoming war, and while some of it will power Khorne up, the majority of the psychic essence that produces will instead be redirected and absorbed by their gods, Khalam and Chicane, Gork and Mork respectively. If that was the intention of their creation, it clearly didn't work out too well, since the Realm of Souls still got blended into Super Hell during the War in Heaven, but we still have the gods be personifications of the overall species. With that, consider, what is a core fundament of the Orkish mind? The desire to fight stronger opponents and grow stronger yourself. Exporting that to the level of the gods, given how Khorne is currently considered to be the strongest out of the Chaos Great Four, Gork and Mork would very likely love to go and try beating the brakes off of him. However, another core aspect of the Orks is that they want things to happen fast, immediately if possible. Delayed gratification is a concept the overwhelming majority of them not only fail to understand, but absolutely hate. So while the Great Twins might want to clap the Red One, he's fortified his domain and will bog them down with unending waves of his silly demons, even the strongest of which would just be an inconvenience to a god, Skarbrand being a prime example of that. If they have to slog through an unending tide of boring weaklings first, the two wouldn't really bother doing so when they can instead fight each other. But in this theory I'm proposing, that craving to match metal with the Lord of the Skull Throne still itches at them. Yet how to get to that without the boring parts? Well, what if, by some cunningly brutal Morkish scheme, one of their worshippers gets gifted a nice juicy monster steak, giving him a taste for kicking demon ass so ravenously that he takes all his boys into the depths of super hell to get more. And it just so happens that the rampage they unleash first piques Khorne's interest by demolishing his rivals' property before finally arriving on his own. To some, complete chance. But to this rat, that route between demon worlds may have been more directly guided than initially presumed. Obviously, Khorne of all people would come to love the Orks and their antics, so he plants them right outside his house's door and just lets them do their thing. Fighting, growing, multiplying. True, he's probably receiving more empowerment from them being in his realm, but via their presumed built-in tether to their own gods, he has practically created an infinite money glitch for Wa energy. And if he doesn't put a stop to it, likely due to hubris as previously mentioned, there may come a time where those orcs hit a critical mass that allows Gork and Mork to break into his realm, skipping all the boring seas of demons and coming right to his doorstep. Hell, the theory that Angron killed Commissar Yarrick and getting Ghazgul to go after him rabidly mad could be a cascading side plot for an additional breach, or at least a distraction for the first one to be more successful, resulting in a truly cataclysmic scrap that sees the balance of the warp food chain severely disrupted, creating even more chaos. Honestly, thinking about it now that I'm writing this, I wouldn't be surprised if such a plot was not wholly original to the two big greens, but had Tzeentch's tentacle prints all over it as well. Alas, until any crumb of confirmation for it is given in a future book or story, all of that remains a fanciful delusion by yours truly. But what do you think? Do let me know in the comments below, smash the like button, and share the video. If you'll permit me a bit of YouTuber cringe, I would also like to request for you to subscribe to the channel. I would really appreciate it, as I'd like to reach at least 1,000 subscribers by the end of the year. You have my sincerest thanks in advance for your support. Until next time, I wish you a lovely rest of your day. Do widzenia.